The reading this week is Psalm 106, verses 4 through 12. Remember me, Lord, when you show favor to your people. Come to my aid when you save them, that I may enjoy the prosperity of your chosen ones, that I may share in the joy of your nation and join your inheritance in giving praise. We have sinned, even as our ancestors did. We have done wrong and acted wickedly. When our ancestors were in Egypt, they gave no thought to your miracles. They did not remember your many kindnesses, and they rebelled by the sea, the Red Sea. Yet he saved them for his name's sake, to make his mighty power known. He rebuked the Red Sea, and it dried up. He led them through the depths as through a desert. He saved them from the hand of the foe, from the hand of the enemy. He redeemed them. The waters covered their adversaries, not one of them survived. Then they believed his promises and sang his praise.
Well, for the last few weeks, we have been following Jesus on a journey on the way to Jerusalem. And I think it's important for us to remember that that journey has been for Passover. That for the same reason that JFK didn't go to Dallas to get shot, Jesus did not come to Jerusalem to get killed. He was coming for Passover. Now, Jesus knew that he was born to die, and he knew that his path led to the cross. But the purpose for his trip was Passover. The context of the sacrifice that Jesus made was Passover. He had tried to share with his disciples what this was all going to be about, what was about to happen as they arrived in Jerusalem. He tried 3 times, and they didn't seem to get it, or perhaps they didn't want to get it. They didn't want to understand the true purpose that Jesus had, but it was Passover. Passover is one of the 3 big feasts that the Jewish people had, these gatherings that they would all come to Jerusalem for. There was Paschal, Passover, there was Shavuot, the Pentecost gathering, and then there was Sukkot, which was a feast of tabernacles. Passover, though, was probably the most formative of the 3. The children of Israel, you remember, had been toiling in Egypt for 400 years as slaves, and God heard the cry of his people. God called Moses to come and speak to Pharaoh and say famously, "Let my people go," but Pharaoh refused. So God used Moses to create 10 sign acts, 10 little parables out of 10 plagues, 10 signs of divine and divisive power. These plagues, in turn, demonstrated that the God of Israel was greater than all the gods of Egypt. And we went through each and every one of these parables. The God of Israel is greater than Hapi, the god of the Nile River. The God of Israel is greater than Heket, the frog god of fertility. The God of Israel is greater than Khepri, the god of the flies, or Hathor, the god of livestock. The God of Israel is greater than Isis, the god of medicine and peace, and Nut, the god of the sky, and Ra, the god of the sun. And finally, the God of Israel is greater than Pharaoh, who himself considered himself to be a god, a son of the gods, if you will. In Goshen, Israelite families survived the final plague by putting blood on their doorposts. We typically picture it as blood on the lintel over the top of the door, but if you read the text, it's actually blood on the sides, blood on the top, and blood on the threshold, blood all the way around the doorway. It was marked with the blood of the Passover lamb that had been slain that night and was eaten, consumed in haste with unleavened bread, and with their coats and shoes still on, ready to go. The blood of the lamb marked the doors of exit for every Israelite home, and they were spared. There's probably some symbolism there, being born through a doorway marked with blood. But why is this remembrance called Passover? I mean, of all the things that happened that day or that week, of all the things that make this moment significant for Israel, why Passover? Why not Independence Day? Why not Escape from Egypt Day or End of Slavery or Freedom Festival or something like that? Why is it this last plague, this last deliverance of the firstborns from the angel of death? Why is that what stands out as the defining mark of God's power? Why is it that the whole event is remembered by that one experience? Well, there's a lot to say here, and maybe this is where we're headed as we wrap up our Genesis sermon series that we'll pick up next week. Maybe we're on our way to Exodus. But this morning we're going to say this much. The sign act of Passover has everything to do with why we're here this morning and with what we're celebrating this morning. Why today is special. In Exodus chapter 4, verse 22, God says, Israel is my firstborn. And it's a curious statement to make. How is Israel a firstborn? Israel is not the first nation that was ever created. And Joseph wasn't a firstborn. Even technically, Jacob wasn't a firstborn. What does God mean by this? Well, the rabbis had struggled for this for a long time. But they came to the conclusion that something was happening through Passover. Something was being created. A new nation was being born through this experience. In the Hebrew text, the Hebrew families all exited their doorways marked with blood. Does that sound like anything to you? They then were delivered through the Red Sea, a practice that rabbis for centuries have compared to a birth canal. A nation was born through the water and through blood. And they were born into the inhospitable desert. I remember watching a documentary a number of years ago by a liberal theologian that held no quarter for the authority of Scripture. And he was standing on the edge of the fertile land in Egypt, looking out over the wilderness of sin in the Sinai Peninsula, and he said, it's impossible for a large group of people, like 1 million people, to enter into this desert. They would die, they would starve, they would die of thirst. It's impossible, and he's absolutely right. Passing into the desert is a death sentence. And at first, that's what the Israelites thought too. They all thought, like, what? Have you brought us out here to die? Was there a shortage of graves in Egypt so that you brought us out here so that we might die? The desert was a place of death. And God's people, 400 years earlier, had entered into Egypt as a dysfunctional family. But they exited Egypt a new nation. A new people was born. And they were brought to a place of death. We too have been brought through a place of death. For more than a year, this building has sat empty on Sunday mornings. 56 Sundays. It has been stripped back to bare walls and bare concrete. The roof has been taken off. The siding has been removed. Every window in the building has been removed and replaced. Anything that wasn't bolted down was carried out of here into storage. We have been scattered to our homes, separated. Institutionally, we have been dead for more than a year. Disembodied, perhaps, but unable to meet. Even now, we're able to meet, sort of. Some of us here, 56 is our new magic number. Some of us are able to be here. I know there's lots of you that are still at home today. If we as a congregation were dead, we're not quite back to life again. That'll come later. There is a Sunday still to come when we're all going to meet, all of us. And we're going to meet with our friends and hopefully our neighbors. No masks, no social distancing. We look forward to that day. But until then, we still travail with the signs of institutional death still clinging to us like grave clothes. COVID is real, but it's not an ultimate reality. God has carried us collectively from death to new life, and He has been more than faithful. He has carried us to new life as a wordless sign act. Our God is superior to all the other gods, all the other idols that are worshipped around us. This year, we have learned God has demonstrated He is more trustworthy than our plans. This year, God has demonstrated He is more faithful than our employers and our careers. Our God is more generous than our government. He is more satisfying than our gods of certainty. As we lay down these idols, we have discovered God provides more than our kids' sports and activities and our packed schedules ever could. And maybe we've still got more to learn on that score. Maybe that is why we still aren't out of our year in the wilderness. But this year of the wilderness has marked us. It has not left us unscathed. We have been changed. We have been reborn. We are not the same church that left this building on March 9th, 2020. We have learned something about ourselves, passing through institutional death to life. Perhaps this pandemic persists because we've still got a little bit more to learn. We have learned that church doesn't just happen in a building, haven't we? Church doesn't only happen at the appointed hour. It happens in a park. It happens in our living rooms. How many of us have had a little church service? How many of us have had a little church service in the grocery store over the past year, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered, in the aisle, the bread aisle, or maybe at the bakery? We have gathered there, and there have been some songs of praise. There have been some prayers and some testimony. We have worshiped in other places this year, other than this building. Ironically, as this building has been rebuilt, we have realized that we don't need it. We will use it, but we don't need it. But we will use it. We have observed that the body of Christ has been broken in our living rooms and served to us by our toddlers. These 5 cups have served as our communion cups for the past year, the noblest purpose these cups have ever served. They have become part of our practice of communion. Cups just buried in the cupboard somewhere and now given a noble purpose for a year. Communion has changed. It looks different for now than it looked in the past. It looks a little smaller, to be honest. We now partake of communion with people that aren't present with us. This morning, we will partake of communion both here and online at the same time. People will be in their homes while we are here. Communion has changed, and communion is changing us. Our body has been broken in other ways this year. We've lost more marriages this year than we have ever lost. You might not even know the losses yet. We have suffered a great loss this year. Our collective body has suffered grief and loss. We hold space for Barry, and we hold space for June, and it doesn't feel right to be here this morning. Most of us have not had a chance to say goodbye. We've not had a chance to hold each other and say, I love you. It's grief that's been arrested somehow, or paused, or stuck. And it's going to take some time for us to work through all of that. We've lost other loved ones too, fathers and brothers and sisters and mothers and dear friends. And because of border restrictions and regulations, we can't say goodbye the way we would like to. This season of sickness has not yet passed, and in some ways, we're still in Egypt. In some ways, we can still see the walls of water, our deliverance on our left and on our right. But we're a different church, and I believe that we have a more robust imagination for what it means to be the church now than we did a year ago. For a while, we weren't in this place, and we were still a church, right? We were still the body of Christ in Camden, and in St. Catharines, and in Grimsby, and in Beamsville, and Welland, and Niagara-on-the-Lake, and Vineland, and even Wellandport, and St. Anne's. We can still check up on each other. We just don't have to do it out in the foyer on Sunday mornings. We've discovered that we can check up on each other by calling each other on a Tuesday. That's okay. Our church is being changed. We are being changed from death to life. How have we continued to exist for more than a year without seeing each other, without hearing each other's voices? Seeing some of the kids this morning has been a sobering shock, to see how much they have grown, to see how much older they have gotten. And surely we haven't gotten older or grown. We may find we'll forget some names over the next few weeks, or maybe struggle to recognize people behind masks. We have experienced a death of sorts. Some of us have had COVID over the past year and not told a soul. Perhaps out of an irrational fear or not wanting to worry people. Some of us have struggled with cancer or mental illness. All alone, we've been hiking the valley of sickness, illness, and loss, all on our own. But Jesus this morning is calling us out of the grave, out of the former ways and into the light. With new life comes new courage, courage to reconnect. Courage to share more than just, how are you? Fine. Maybe we can find the courage to reconnect this week and share a hurt from this past year, or share a failing or a confession with someone else. We're changing from death to new life. Perhaps we weren't as spiritually grounded as we would have liked to think as we headed into this year. Not worshiping for most of the year might have ended up not being as big a burden as we would have hoped. Far less difficult than we thought. Perhaps we recognize that church is just something that we do for social purposes, and we've got other outlets for that. Perhaps through this year-long interruption in our worship practices, we discovered we're the only ones in our house that feel the call to practice the rhythms of faith. We've discovered this, and we frankly don't know what to do with it. This morning, Jesus is calling us out of the grave. He's calling us out to abandon the habits of death, the guilt of failure, the fear of the unknown, and to leave these things in the grave like grave clothes, cast aside, not needed anymore, and renew the practices of life. In this journey from death to new life, Jesus embodies it. He shows us how it's done. In the same way Jesus took his people and formed them into a new nation, a chosen people, by means of the water and the blood, Jesus acts out this same transformation and now invites us to do the same. Jesus receded from life into the domain of death, carrying every shameful deed, carrying every faithless act with him. We are set free. Jesus descended to the bottom of the pit of hell and came through the other side victorious. On this day, we remember that new life comes from death, that new life comes from abandonment, from giving away entitlement and power and seeking the lower place. New life comes from faith. Faith that the same God that raised Jesus from the dead will also raise us to new life. Resurrect our lives from the habits of death to the habits of life. Jesus didn't die on the cross just so that you didn't have to. Jesus died on the cross to show you how. To show you how to live the way of surrender, how to take last place, how to take the way of forgiveness and the way of hope. All is not lost. He is risen. He's made a way. He will one day call us out of our actual physical graves. But for now, resurrection means more than that. It's a way of hope for today. For those of you that are home today, and for those of us that are here this morning, we hope that you can see and that you can hear this new way, this hope that we practice. This is an invitation for us to live in hope, not despair. We're back into a lockdown, but this too shall pass. That we're not all vaccinated yet, but someday soon, many of us will be. We're not all here yet in the building, but someday soon we will be. Lockdowns are not permanent. COVID isn't permanent, and on Easter Sunday we learn death isn't permanent either. That God does not have, the grave does not have the final word, that God does. And to us, death looks permanent and immutable and hopeless. But we are brought to new life. We don't bitterly complain and engage in fruitless speculations with our neighbors online. We're dead to that kind of life. We live subject to the ruling authorities in our lives, the police, government, public health officials, and other public servants who serve us, but we live in hope. We live set free from fear and set free from terminal anxiety. We live in service to others, willing to set down our own freedoms and entitlements for the benefit of others. He is risen, and we have been called back to life as well. Let's sing.